You may be seated. Good morning, St. John. Good morning. Like Mary and Martha from today's gospel, I come before you with a heavy heart full of grief. My dear mother, Grace Grievous Woolridge, died 1 week ago today. Staff at her long-term care facility said she passed peacefully not even 2 hours after my beloved Lisa and I had brought her and her roommate, Miss June, Sunday dinner. I am so grateful to have had those delightful last moments with her. I am the firstborn of 4 and spent the first 7 years of my life as her only child. As Parkinson's began to take over her body some years ago, she feared being left alone, as my siblings and I all live in different states across the country. I promised her that I would be with her to the end, just as it was just her and I at the beginning. Being appointed your evangelist for spiritual healing at the beginning of this year made her more proud than most anything else I have ever done. Just last week in a care conference, her nurse manager was shocked that Mom had not shared one of my sermons with her social worker, as every resident and every other staff member on every shift had been subjected to watching her clips of me from Facebook. I preach today on the heels of All Saints and All Souls Day in her honor and blessed memory. Celebrating the dead and honoring ancestors is a common practice across the globe in many cultures. In East Asia, there is tomb sweeping, considered a reverent act of grave maintenance. In Hong Kong, spirits receive gifts of food, drink, incense, and prayers. In Judaism, it is tradition to light candles and say prayers on the anniversary of losing a loved one. The Asante people of Ghana, West Africa, venerate their matrilineal line as they are seen as the guardians of moral order. Dia de los Muertos, or the Day of the Dead, goes back 3,000 years in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, which included much of Mexico. It honors the dead through rituals, practices, and celebrations, both in the home and throughout the community. Once practiced in the spring in celebration of new life, Spaniard colonizers changed it to be in line with All Saints and All Souls Day, according to the Catholic Church. Halloween originated as a Celtic festival of Samhain, a pagan religious celebration of harvest at the end of summer. People lit bonfires to light the way for lost souls and wore costumes to ward off evil spirits. The color orange symbolized the glow of fall, while the color black spoke to the coming darkness of winter months. In the 8th century, Pope Gregory III designated November 1st as the date to honor saints. All Saints' Day came to incorporate some of the traditions of the pre-existing Samhain celebrations. The evening before All Saints' Day became All Hallows' Eve, and later Halloween. Celtic people believed that during the festival, spirits walked the earth. Later, Christian missionaries introduced All Souls' Day on November 2nd, celebrating all who have died, thus perhaps perpetuating the idea of the dead coming in contact with the living. As Christians, our entire faith is predicated on the death of Jesus, who dies as a human for the sins of all human beings, only to be resurrected 3 days later in his full divinity as the beloved Son of God. In today's gospel reading, we have a popular biblical story of death and resurrection that is probably second only to the story of Christ, the story of Lazarus. Although we often put the emphasis of this story on the miracle of Jesus making Lazarus rise from the dead, I believe that there are equally important points to be made on our way to that much celebrated ending. I think we get so seduced by the divinity of Jesus that we often lose sight of his humanity. those parts of his story that make him just like us. Now, at the start of the verses for today, in John chapter 11, verses 32 through 44, Mary, sister to Lazarus, goes to find Jesus. And although she kneels at his feet, she seems to admonish him for not being with them, believing his presence would have prevented the death of her brother. Jesus sees her sobbing and the sobbing of those who came with her. Verse 33 reads that Jesus was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. Now, I read this as Jesus being very upset, not only at the loss of Lazarus, but also the obvious disappointment of Mary and the others in him because he was absent when they needed him most. In verse 34, Jesus asks, "Where have you laid him?" And they responded, "Lord, come and see." Then in verse 35, Jesus weeps. This is important, as these two words are given their own verse. When I was a child, this was a common short prayer said in a moment needing divine presence or sanctification. The elders would just whisper, "Jesus wept." Now, I see weeping as a very poetic term for the outright guttural sobs that often overcome many of us upon hearing about the death of a loved one. Jesus is essentially set upon by a group of people he knows and loves. They are in deep mourning and look to him for comfort and guidance. So I do not picture a glistening Hollywood tear slowly rolling down the unnaturally thin face of a ghostly pale-skinned Jesus. I see him surrounded by mourners, openly sobbing with some wailing, moaning, and snot bubbles. He is deeply grieved on many levels and joins them in their mourning. Some in the crowd were moved by the sobs of Jesus. Others mocked him, saying, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Verse 38 reads, "Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb." I see this verse reading quite differently than the previous verse 33, where Jesus was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. There, he was emotionally upset by the grief and loss surrounding him. Now, I believe Jesus is disturbed because he is peeved, ticked off by such cold and callous words in the midst of such profound loss and sadness. Verses 39 and 40 is where I think the heart of this story really is. And it reads, Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." And Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" I ask you, where in life have you left God because you thought that part of your life was too stank or disgusting or wrong for God to see, know about, or do anything with you in such darkness? Or maybe you were just disappointed in God because you felt as if you had been forgotten or left behind. When in your life have you said, "I'm going to wait and get myself together before I go back to church, before I pick up my Bible, before I kneel in prayer"? Or maybe I am going to wait for God to show me that he sees me and what I'm going through. How do we not know that those are the very places that God is made for, that he stands ready to walk with us, even destroying death, to help resurrect our spirits from behind our stones and caves of darkness? Who among us has a testimony that isn't about God leading us out of the dark with his glorious light? There is no need for God if we are always in the light of life, never knowing dark times and days that can feel like a living death. Just last week, in my own pit of despair that follows loss and into grief, Reverend Jared reached out in comfort, but also to inquire if I could still preach this first Sunday. With my broken heart and darkened spirit, I said yes, because I knew that the glory of God was greater than my grief and would meet me to unbind the deadening spirit that gripped me. Now, I love all the magic in a miracle Bible story, and yet I think we need to pause more often and notice the times we stop the divine from entering the gloomy, shady places where and when we need it most. That's serious shadow work, allowing God into the stench of our own messy darkness. As much as I love the basic humanity of Jesus, I also love it when he steps into his full divine self in a bold way to let the people know who he is as the Son of God. Verses 41 through 44 read, "So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, 'Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me.'" And I just love this part. "But I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." I think too often we picture Jesus as this pale, meek, quiet, hollow and dewy-eyed, thin-haired, gaunt figure covered in pristine glow-in-the-dark clothes. This image is so common in many pieces of art. I see Jesus as a man with thick, uncombed, free-form locks of hair, a ruddy brown complexion born of his true ethnicity, the sun, and a life spent outside and on the sea. I picture him with a lanky but remarkably strong build. In my mind, he is dressed in the dingy robes of the time and sandals worn to the nub. You know, like when people wear their Birkenstocks down to the cork soles. He looks the part of the nomad he was, and his voice is strong and bold from speaking to large crowds and casting out demons. In verses 41 and 42, he showed the people the strength of his words in a purposeful, audible prayer, speaking aloud the conviction of his belief and faith in God to hear him and act accordingly. Then with all that, calls out in a loud voice for Lazarus to come out, instructing those nearby to unbind Lazarus from the trappings of death. I want you to know that Jesus stands ready to enter the dark and dank places we try to hide from our own selves and others. The glory of God will flood those places with light and fill you with new life. You will be able to rise up and free yourself of the trappings of whatever form of death is holding you down. Use your own loud and bold voice to pray with unwavering faith, inviting him to enter the hidden place within you. We must allow God to be God and let God do what God does. Mary showed us in the beginning of the story that sometimes we must invite miracles to come to us. And then Martha taught us that we have to permit divine power to enter our stinky secret places, because with faith, we know the glory of God will set us free from all forms of death, giving us new life, hope, and possibility that we can rise renewed in body, mind, and spirit. Before I close today, I want to acknowledge the importance of this coming week. The eyes of the world are upon us as we go into an intense and historic presidential election. I am not here to tell you how to vote, but I do want to speak to the anxiety and stress that is gripping many of us. I want to go quickly through a few verses to help sustain us, no matter the outcome. I believe as Christians and people of faith, we are being called to a time such as this. Hebrews 11:1 defines faith as the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 and 11 tells us to make ourselves ready no matter what happens. It reads, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes." James chapter 2, verses 17 reminds us of our responsibility when it says, "Faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead." So as a fellow American and Christian sibling, I strongly urge you to take part in the democratic process of our country. Today's Psalm 24, verses 1 and 10, reminds us to not despair. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and all who dwell therein. Who is he, this King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. And today's epistle from Revelations chapter 21, verse 5 and 6 tells us who has the ultimate control of all things. And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end." Please vote, my fellow citizens. We have a responsibility in this world until we are called into the next. As Christian people, we are indeed required to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Amen? Amen. Amen.
You will find the next portion of our service printed in your Book of Common Prayer, that black book in the pew back in front of you with the gold cross on the cover. Please open to page 304. Please stand. Do you believe in God the Father? Do you believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God?